A young Netflix employee is looked down upon for not speaking fluent English, until a millionaire chooses her to represent the company at an international event. In the vastness of a luxurious Los Angeles auditorium, packed with impeccably suited businessmen and watchful journalists, a young Netflix representative is called to the stage to help translate a simple question. But when she opens her mouth, her voice trembles. The English words tangle, and the laughter echoes like sharp blades. Slicing through her dignity, some executives whisper among themselves, others burst out laughing, and someone records the embarrassing scene with a cell phone, which quickly spreads across social media. Embarrassed, she lowers her gaze, her face burning with blush and her hands clasped tightly against her body. It was supposed to be a moment of support, but it became a cruel spectacle in which her lack of fluency in English turned her into a national joke. In front of hundreds of people, she felt small, invisible, crushed by contempt, as if the entire world had been programmed to ridicule her vulnerability. However, the sudden silence of the auditorium breaks the cycle of humiliation. A man stands up from the front row, tall, elegant, with a serious gaze that carries the authority of someone who doesn't need to say much to be heard. He is one of the most powerful investors in the entertainment industry, owner of multiple technology companies, and a financial partner of Netflix itself. Everyone watches him, waiting for him to join the chorus of mockery. But to everyone's astonishment, he announces in a firm voice, "This is exactly the girl I want to represent Netflix at the next international event in New York." Shock courses through the audience like electricity. Those who had been laughing minutes before now fall silent, unable to comprehend. That ridiculed young woman with her thick accent and shaky English is publicly chosen by the millionaire. The logic of humiliation is reversed, and those who despised her feel the invisible weight of karma hanging in the air. If this scene has already made you feel the shame, injustice, and unexpected twists that life can bring, don't miss it. Subscribe to the channel now to follow each new story that touches your heart and exposes the power of destiny. Leave a like to further strengthen this space where we reveal that no one stays on the ground forever. And write in the comments, do you believe that justice comes at the right time, even when everyone seems against you? Your answer may inspire others who are also living their own silent battles. The immense Los Angeles auditorium vibrated with the glare of spotlights, gigantic screens, and the constant hum of voices mingling in multiple languages. It was one of those international events where every detail was calculated to impress. The impeccable costumes, the rehearsed smiles, the crystal glasses reflecting bluish lights, the looks that carried more weight than words. The air smelled of expensive perfume and anticipation. It was a stage reserved only for giants, for executives carrying millions in handshake decisions. And in the midst of it all, almost invisible, she was there. The young Netflix attendant walked quickly through the side aisles, clutching papers and tablets, her eyes always downcast, as if afraid of being noticed. Her colleagues regarded her with a mixture of indifference and contempt. After all, she wasn't part of the show, just behind the scenes. But that day fate would pull her into the spotlight. The Netflix CEO needed someone to help him engage spontaneously with the international audience, and by a cruel irony, they singled her out. "You, come up and translate." His blood ran cold, but there was no way he could refuse in front of so many cameras. As he walked to the stage, he heard muffled giggles, some even clear, "This is going to be funny." She climbed slowly, her heart pounding so loudly it seemed to echo in the microphones. The contrast was stark, the brilliance of the stage against the simplicity of her presence, the grandeur of the surrounding costumes against the timid delicacy of her cheap dress. The lights blinded her, but what hurt most were the stares, like blades that mercilessly stripped her naked. There, among arrogant businessmen, journalists hungry for a fall, and hundreds of cell phones ready to record any slip-up, the attendant became a character in a scene she hadn't rehearsed. And in that instant, everyone could sense it. Something was about to happen. Something that would change the course of that night and leave profound marks on the lives of everyone who witnessed that moment. Her childhood was never one of easy laughter or lingering hugs. She was born in the heart of Texas, in a small town marked by the dust of dry roads and the heavy silence of simple houses. Her father, a gruff man, disappeared before she learned to write her own name. Her mother, exhausted from trying to support the household alone, fell ill early and left when she was only 12. From then on, life taught her, without gentleness, that the world had no room for fragility. She was raised in foster homes, families who saw her as a temporary burden, someone they could discard at the first sign of difficulty. Each move was a scar, and each rejection, an invisible brick in the wall she built around her heart. Still, there was a stubborn flame within her, an almost childlike desire to believe that at some point she would be noticed, chosen, loved unconditionally. As a teenager, while others dreamed of proms and prestigious colleges, she dreamed only of having food on the table and a permanent place to sleep. She worked in diners, cleaned offices after midnight, and babysat to earn a few dollars. Books were her only refuge. She read in secret in public libraries, devouring stories in English, even though her thick accent betrayed her Hispanic heritage every time. She opened her mouth. She carried an old notebook where she jotted down words and phrases she didn't understand, vowing to herself that one day she would master the language that seemed to hold the key to escaping her condition. But life seemed to delight in slowing her down. She was rejected in job interviews simply for not speaking perfect English. She was called incapable on more than one occasion. Her classmates ridiculed her for the strange way she pronounced certain words, and this collective laughter became a haunting ghost. Even so, she didn't give up. She landed a modest job at Netflix serving customers in Spanish. The pay was small, but it represented stability, something rare in her career. She spent her days resolving subscription issues, listening to impatient complaints, always responding with the calm life had taught her. Deep down, she knew she didn't belong in that cramped cubicle, but she didn't have the courage to dream too big. Behind her shyness lay a sharp mind and a calloused heart. She carried old pains, the shame of never having had a family to applaud her small achievements, the weight of feeling invisible in a country that constantly reminded her she was a foreigner. She held within herself all the humiliation she had suffered, but also a silent faith that perhaps one day someone would see beyond her accent, beyond her simple clothes, beyond the label of disposable employee. She didn't know it, but that day was closer than she had ever dared imagine, and it would come in the most cruel and unexpected way possible, amid hostile looks, hurtful laughter, and an audience determined to test her to the limit. The event was in full swing when the scene that would change everything began to unfold. It was an international conference where technology and entertainment companies were vying not only for attention, but also for prestige. The stage had already been filled with grandiose speeches, impressive figures, and promises of innovation. The atmosphere was tense, masked by well-practiced smiles. Everyone knew any slip-up could make headlines. Backstage, however, a group of young Netflix executives, arrogant with status and the security of their positions, were exchanging dirty jokes. They had noticed the presence of the simple attendant, the one who served coffee during breaks and organized papers without ever being noticed. To them, she was the perfect target for a cruel bet. "I bet you $50 she can't." "Translate a simple sentence into English," one of them said, his voice thick with mockery. "50? I'll make it 100, another replied, laughing, as he stared at the young woman from afar. "She'll barely open her mouth and she'll freeze immediately." The cruelty didn't stop there. The buzz grew, and soon the idea took shape. One of the executives suggested to the stage director that they bring in someone simple and real to interact with the audience, as a way to showcase diversity. The suggestion was a trap, and the director, unaware of the malice behind it, accepted. The finger pointed at her. The young woman's heart raced when she heard her name echoed. Some laughed before she even reached the stage, as if they had already foreseen the scene that would unfold. The audience, made up of international investors, journalists, and entertainment celebrities, waited anxiously. The microphone was placed in his hands as if handing over an impossible weight. The English he had studied So much in silence seemed to evaporate before so many eyes. He tried to pronounce the first words, but nervousness took over. A mistake here, another there, and soon the laughter erupted. Cameras captured every second, and the raised cell phones ensured that the scene would spread like wildfire. Behind the scenes, the executives who had initiated the bet exchanged malicious glances. For them, it was fun. For her, it was the rebirth of all her old scars. The collective laughter was the same as that of her classmates who had mocked her accent in school, the same look of contempt from those who rejected her in interviews. In that moment, she felt small, as if her entire life were repeating itself in a cruel spiral, pushing her back to the place of invisibility and pain she had tried so hard to overcome. But what no one knew was that the stage for that humiliation would, paradoxically, be the same one where her destiny would change forever. Because among the hundreds of laughing eyes, there was one that observed her in silence, with the gravity of someone who sees beyond appearances. The silence after the laughter seemed unbearable, as if every second echoed inside her chest. It was at that moment that the millionaire rose from the front row, and all eyes turned to him. Tall, with an imposing posture, and the cold expression of someone not one to waste words, he walked to the stage. The sound of his footsteps echoing on the gleaming floor mingled with the rapid beating of the young woman's heart. She didn't dare look up, simply gripping the microphone with trembling hands, expecting yet another humiliation, perhaps even more cruel, this time from someone with enough power to crush her completely. But instead of contempt, it was his firm hand that reached out to her, asking for the microphone. "Let me help you," he said in perfect English, but with a tone that carried an almost knowing surprise. He looked at the audience and added, "This young woman speaks the language that many of you have forgotten, the language of courage." An uncomfortable silence filled the room. She looked up for the first time and met his eyes. It was as if this man could pierce through the layers of pain she hid and see beyond her flaws. The contact lasted only a few seconds, but it was enough to create an invisible connection. He handed the microphone back, not condescendingly, but like someone returning a weapon to a wounded warrior. She realized she wasn't being saved. She was being challenged. This was their first direct contact, brief, silent, and tense. As the audience tried to decipher the gesture, they sensed something in his gaze saying, "I know who you are, even if you don't know it yet." It was in that instant, on the suffocatingly lit stage, that a bond was born, not of romance, not of pity, but of destiny. A bond that would turn the tide in ways no one in that auditorium could have predicted. The stage lights were still burning her eyes, when after that brief contact, the audience erupted in whispers. Many saw the scene as a provocation from the millionaire, others as a bad joke, but the executives who had set up the bet couldn't bear to miss the spectacle. One of them, laughing loudly enough for everyone to hear, said mockingly, "Oh sure, now we're sending a call center representative to represent Netflix in New York. Is this serious or just to go viral on TikTok?" The laughter filled the auditorium again, this time louder because it had been authorized by someone wearing an expensive suit and silk tie. Another executive added, "This girl can't even order a coffee in English without getting confused, let alone giving a speech to international investors. You've got to be kidding." She felt her throat tighten, her face burning, her legs wanting to give way. Each word of derision was like a whip, dragging her back to the pain of childhood, to the cruel laughter of her classmates who mocked her accent. Only this wasn't a school hallway. It was an international stage, and the whole world watched her stumble. Cell phones held high ensured the humiliation would spread like wildfire. Some journalists were already typing on their devices, preparing cruel headlines. The air grew heavier, almost unbearable. The millionaire tried to intervene, but the ironic whispers wouldn't stop. Forced diversity, cheap marketing, shame on the company. These phrases snaked through the rows. And although his gaze conveyed firmness and protection, the collective weight of the crowd seemed greater. She, at the center of it all, breathed deeply, trying not to let the tears fall. She knew that if she cried on that stage, she would be forever swallowed up by ridicule. Then, one of the younger executives, the one who had initiated the bet, raised his wineglass and said loudly, "I double my bet. This girl will never be more than a waitress. Never." The phrase echoed like a final sentence. The laughter returned, louder, sharper, more cruel. And for the first time that night she lifted her face not to confront, but to let herself be seen. In her eyes was a mixture of pain and something no one could read, a hidden secret, a silence that would soon become the turning point of history. In that moment, at the height of public humiliation, the seed of poetic justice was also born, which would one day crush each of those peals of laughter. She stepped off the stage with slow steps, as if carrying an invisible weight on her shoulders, but without betraying the collapse everyone expected. The executives still laughed among themselves, some slapping each other on the back, certain they had witnessed the final spectacle. The millionaire, however, kept his gaze fixed on her, intrigued by how she didn't fall apart in front of the crowd. When the side door closed behind her, the noise of the auditorium faded, leaving only the echo of her rapid breathing mixed with a forced calm. It was in this silence that she removed the badge from her neck, stared at her own name printed on the cheap plastic and smiled, not with joy but with something much deeper, almost defiant. Because, contrary to what everyone believed, she hadn't been caught off guard. She knew about the bet before she even took the stage. She heard the whispers in the hallway, the barely suppressed giggles, the promise of $50, then $100 if she failed. She could have refused, she could have pretended not to hear, but she chose to accept. She took the stage aware of the spectacle they were planning at the cost of her shame, because there was something inside her that wanted to see how far they would go. Every broken English word, every awkward pause, was not just a product of nervousness, but also part of a silent game, showing the arrogant how much they depended on ridiculing the weak to feel strong. In the women's restroom, where she took refuge for a few minutes, she stared at her reflection in the stained mirror and let out a short, almost bitter laugh. It wasn't the first time her accent had been mocked, nor the first time they'd tried to crush her in public. But something was different about that night. Now there were too many witnesses, too many cameras, too many eyes. What the executives didn't know was that the video mocking her, spreading across the internet, was also being watched by thousands of Netflix subscribers, Hispanic customers who would immediately identify with her struggle. And that's why, when he reappeared backstage, his head was no longer bowed. He walked past the smiling executives with unexpected serenity, and when he met the millionaire's gaze again, he didn't look away. On the contrary, he held his gaze firmly, as if saying without words, "I saw everything, I know everything, and it's not me you should laugh at, but yourselves." He, surprised, couldn't help but raise his eyebrows slightly. For the first time, he realized that this girl wasn't just a victim. She was someone, hiding more layers than she let on. The weight of humiliation still hurt, but now it wasn't pure pain. It was fuel. Deep down, she knew this game was far from over, and that the scene everyone thought was a defeat would be just the beginning of a turnaround none of them dared imagine. That same night, as the event continued with its lavish programming, the millionaire couldn't get the image of the young woman out of his mind. There was something in her gaze, something that didn't match the fragility everyone expected. It wasn't just pain. It was a silent resistance, like someone accustomed to falling, but always getting back up stronger. The uneasiness followed him backstage, where he discreetly asked for information about the employee. The organizers, surprised by his interest, handed over a simple dossier: name, department, modest position in multilingual customer service. But it was on a forgotten sheet of paper, a seemingly irrelevant detail, that he found the first piece of the puzzle. Before working at Netflix, she had been a scholarship student on an international exchange program, but had dropped out for personal reasons. Curious, he called in his own team of private investigators, a common occurrence in his business routine, where trusting information was vital. Within hours, he had learned what no one in that auditorium knew. That simple young woman, ridiculed for not speaking perfect English, was actually the daughter of a Mexican immigrant who, years earlier, had led a lawsuit against one of the largest technology networks in the United States for exploiting cheap labor. The case had gained notoriety, but was suppressed with financial settlements and imposed silence. She was that woman's daughter. More than that, the records showed that during her adolescence the girl had excelled in Spanish literature competitions, recognized for her ability to translate complex texts. English, yes, was still her Achilles heel, but her mind was brilliant. The millionaire read and reread the information, feeling the weight of the contrast between who she really was and what the audience had chosen to see. She wasn't just a humiliated employee. She was someone with a history marked by fighting corporate injustice, exactly the kind of ghost those executives smiling on stage would never want to see come to light. When he saw her again hours later in the now empty corridors of the convention center, he found her packing her things in silence, her badge tucked into her bag as if burying a chapter. He approached cautiously and, for the first time, spoke softly, without an audience, without cameras. "You're not who they think you are you?" She looked up and, with a flash of sincerity, replied, "I've never hidden who I am. They're the ones who never really wanted to look." In that instant, the millionaire realized the truth clearly. She wasn't a fragile piece of a cruel spectacle. She was the silent threat that could expose the full rot of the system they represented, and for the first time in many years, he felt he wasn't just a waitress, but a mirror that forced him to see his own choices and the fragility of an empire sustained by contempt and arrogance. After that night, she simply disappeared. She didn't show up at the office the next morning, didn't respond to her supervisor's cold messages or the curious looks of her colleagues. Her badge was found on her desk, like a silent farewell. To many, she was just another employee who couldn't handle the pressure and vanished without a trace. But for him, there was something disturbing about her disappearance. The millionaire, accustomed to people chasing his attention, now found himself staring at the void left by a girl everyone considered insignificant. In the following days, he continued his routine of meetings, trips, and million-dollar decisions, but nothing seemed to have the same flavor. The lavish dinners, once accompanied by applause and flattery, now had a bitter aftertaste. Her memory crept in at the most unlikely times, in the silence of a private jet, between presentations, even in the noise of the New York streets. There was something about her absence that gnawed at him, as if he had missed a unique opportunity to understand something greater than money or power. He began searching for her silently. He called contacts at the company, but no one knew. He asked for discreet reports on her life, but learned little. She had terminated the lease on the small apartment where she lived, withdrawn her last savings from the bank, and disappeared without a trace. For someone who had always lived under the weight of invisibility, disappearing was her most powerful weapon. And it was in this emptiness that he began to miss not only her presence, but what she represented. For the first time in years, he realized his life was surrounded by people who applauded him out of self-interest, but none of them had the genuine gaze she carried. Her absence became a painful mirror, revealing how much his existence was shrouded in falsehood. He, the man who had always believed he had everything, began to realize that perhaps he had never had anything essential. His downfall began silently, almost imperceptibly, like cracks in a wall everyone believed too solid to give way. In the days after the event, videos of the young woman's humiliation went viral, but not with the tone executives had hoped. Social media transformed the audience's laughter into a symbol of corporate arrogance, and millions of subscribers, especially from the Latino and immigrant communities across the country, began demanding answers. Boycott hashtags emerged, and international newspaper articles highlighted the scene as an example of veiled racism and elitism. And at the center of it all, his name was also dragged. After all, he had stood up and publicly chosen the girl to represent them. For some, it was an act of courage, but for others, it seemed like a cold marketing ploy, a calculated gesture to clean up the company's image. The newspapers questioned, who was this employee? Why did he defend her? What was behind that firm gaze? And the questions began to turn into accusations. Emergency meetings were called. The same executives who had laughed at her now pointed the finger at him, trying to deflect blame. "You jeopardized our image," they said. "You turned an inside joke into an international scandal." The irony was cruel. The man, accustomed to dictating rules and being flattered, now found himself isolated, judged by the invisible court of public opinion and the shadows of his peers. In the following weeks, his downfall deepened. Old investigations into shady contracts at his companies began to resurface, fueled by journalists seeking a narrative thread of social justice in the attendant's case. What began as a humiliating video became a dossier against the empire he built. The stock markets reacted. The respect that had once been expressed in handshakes was replaced by looks of distrust. And deep down, what ate at him most wasn't the financial losses, but the void she left. Because while the world judged him, the only voice he wanted to hear, hers, remained silent. Her absence was more deafening than any headline, and he began to realize that it wasn't just his reputation that was in ruins, but also the illusion that he controlled everything. The millionaire, accustomed to controlling every detail of his life, with the coolness of a seasoned gambler, began to realize that what was crumbling wasn't just his public image, but something much deeper. The numbers were still there, full bank accounts, solid investments, untouched assets, but none of it filled the void opening inside him. For the first time, power was no longer a shield. In the silent early mornings before the enormous windows of his New York apartment, he would see himself reflected in the glass, surrounded by illuminated skyscrapers, and the question would arise like an uncomfortable whisper, "Who am I without the applause?" The transformation didn't come from a sudden epiphany, but from small cracks in his pride. He remembered her gaze on stage, steadfast even amidst the collective laughter, serene even in the face of shame. That gaze haunted him in meetings, business lunches, even in the silence of the car. He realized that the young woman without titles, without fortune, without influence, carried something he had never possessed: authenticity. She needed no masks. He, on the other hand, found himself a prisoner of his own armor, sustained by an image that now suffocated him. She began to change her habits almost involuntarily. She began to reject lavish invitations she had previously accepted out of convenience. She avoided parties where everyone laughed too loudly and no one said anything truthful. She returned to walking the streets alone, without security guards following her steps, trying to rediscover the city she had lost sight of years ago. At night, she read reports and newspapers, but always ended up returning to the notes her team had made about her life. She discovered details she had never noticed: how she worked double time to pay for language courses, how she quietly helped colleagues, how she brought food from home to save every penny. Little by little, he realized he wanted something money couldn't buy: forgiveness. Not just from her, but from himself. Forgiveness for having fed the same system that had crushed him, for having remained silent so many times in the face of similar injustices, for having believed that greatness lay in profits rather than gestures. His routine, previously marked by contracts and figures, became permeated by an almost spiritual restlessness. He no longer sought to win debates, but to understand silences. He no longer wanted just to expand companies, but to right wrongs. This transformation was invisible to the public. No newspaper reported his sleepless nights or his silences during meetings, but within him, a new man was beginning to emerge. He didn't yet know if he'd have the chance to prove this change to her, but one thing was clear: he wasn't the same anymore. And perhaps for the first time, he was beginning to become someone worthy of being looked in the eye without shame. Their reunion didn't take place on a brightly lit stage or in a luxurious office, but in a local public library weeks after the scandal. He, who had begun, wandering into places he would never have set foot in before, wandered in almost by chance, seeking silence and answers that his team's cold reports couldn't provide. And there she was, sitting before a stack of language books, with simple headphones and a notebook full of notes. She didn't seem like the same young woman humiliated before arrogant executives. There was a serene calm in her demeanor, a dignity that didn't depend on an audience. He paused in the doorway for a few seconds, watching, not daring to approach. It was strange. The man who had confronted tycoons and politicians with a firm voice now hesitated before a girl with a pencil in her hand. But he took a deep breath and walked toward her. She looked up slowly, and upon recognizing him, she showed neither surprise nor resentment, only a heavy silence, as if she had been waiting for this moment to arrive. "I've been looking everywhere for you," he said, his voice lower than ever. She closed the notebook carefully. And replied, "And what do you hope to find now? An excuse, a returning employee, or just someone to ease your conscience?" Her words were sharp, but there was no shouting, no anger. It was the coldness of someone who had overcome fear. He swallowed hard. He wanted to say he had changed, that he saw everything differently after her, but he realized he had no right to lecture. So he simply sat before her, silent, and for the first time in years, he allowed himself to simply listen. It was a reunion without hugs or tears, but full of tension and unspoken truths. He realized that even there, surrounded by old books and without any fortune, she held more power than he ever had in his luxurious salons. And in that moment, he understood. If there was any chance of redemption, it would come not from his fortune, but from her decision about what to do with the bond that still existed between them. She looked at him with the calm of someone carrying wounds that have already healed. The reunion in the library hadn't affected her as much as it had him, and it showed. While the millionaire searched for words, almost stumbling over apologies he'd never learned to say, she stood firm, as if silence were her best weapon. Finally, she broke the heaviness of the air. "Do you want to know if I'll forgive you?" she asked without raising her voice. He took a deep breath, as if each second were a sentence. "I haven't come to ask for anything you're not willing to give," he said. And for the first time, he didn't sound like the man who always brought answers. She leaned back in her chair, looked at the closed notebook on the table, and then back at him. "When you humiliated me on that stage, it wasn't just me. It was everyone who carries an accent, who is seen as less than, who works twice as hard to never be recognized. You laughed at my pain, but you laughed at millions like me. It's not me you should ask for forgiveness from." He tried to speak, but she held up her hand and interrupted him. "I know you've changed. I saw it in your eyes here and that night, but the change you seek won't come from my forgiveness. It will come from what you decide to do with the weight you now carry." There was a deep silence. He expected a yes or a no, a clear sentence, but he received something far more powerful: freedom to choose his path, without the crutch of absolution. She then stood up, gathered her books and bag. Before leaving, she looked at him one last time. "I don't harbor hatred, but I also won't dwell on this past. My life goes on." And so, without tears, without hugs, without dramatic goodbyes, she left him sitting alone among shelves of dusty books, his heart heavy and yet open. There was no victory, no defeat. Only the knowledge that from then on everything would depend on what he did with the void she left, and the silent chance to reinvent himself. If you've made it this far, I want to hear your opinion. What would you do in her place? Comment below. I'll read every answer. Don't forget to like, subscribe to the channel for more stories like this, and click on the video that's currently playing on your screen. I'm sure it will captivate you as much as this one.